The courtroom in Duskwell smelled like sawdust and old tobacco, and the particular kind of silence that only exists when everyone in a room is waiting for someone to die. I sat in the defendant's chair with my wrists bound behind my back and the wood pressed into my spine, and the morning light came through the single window at an angle that put everything in shades of yellow and gray, the kind of light that makes even living men look like they are already halfway gone. Judge Harlan Price sat behind his bench. He was an old man, maybe 65, with white hair combed flat against his skull and a black vest that had seen better years. His face was the face of a man who had made many decisions in his life and had learned somewhere along the way to make them without flinching. I had seen that face before, not in a courtroom, in a crowd. 7 days ago, to be exact, standing at the edge of a gathering in the town square, hands clasped behind his back, not speaking, not shouting, not joining the noise the way everyone else was, just watching, just taking inventory. I remember thinking when I first noticed him that in any crowd of loud men, the quiet ones are worth watching. Quiet men in positions of power are not quiet because they have nothing to say. They are quiet because they have already decided what will happen, and they are simply waiting for the rest of the room to catch up. I did not know then what I know now, but I remembered his face. And 7 days later, sitting in his courtroom with my wrists tied and my future balanced on the edge of whatever he decided to say next, I was grateful I had. He looked at me across the length of the room and asked in a voice that carried no particular emotion whether I had any final words before he rendered his verdict. I did. I had quite a few, in fact. "Judge," I said, "before you decide what to do with me, I need you to hear a story. It starts 7 days ago. And if I don't tell it in the right order, nothing that happened will make any sense. Not to you, not to anyone in this room." He studied me for a long moment, the kind of moment where a man is deciding whether to give you rope or take it away. "You have 7 minutes, he said. I nodded. 7 minutes was enough. So I went back to the beginning. 7 days ago I was nobody. That is not self-pity. That is just the truth. I was a man on a horse moving through a territory that had no particular reason to remember me heading toward a town I had never visited for no other reason than that I needed to buy flour and salt and get back on the road before sundown. I had $31 in my coat pocket, a bedroll, a rifle I had not fired in 4 months, and a horse named Dust. Dust was a brown quarter horse, 14 years old, with a white patch above his left eye and a disposition that could best be described as patient. He had been with me through most of the worst years of my life, and he had never once complained about any of it. I considered him without embarrassment to be the most reliable companion I had ever had. We came into Duskwell from the south, down the long, flat road that cuts through the scrubland before the mountains begin to show themselves on the horizon. The Jemez Range was visible to the northwest, purple and enormous against the sky. To the east, the Crimson Pass Formation rose out of the desert like a wound that had never properly healed, all red sandstone and sharp shadow. I had been to New Mexico territory 3 times before in my life. I knew the landscape. I respected it the way a man respects a thing that will kill him without malice if he makes the wrong choice at the wrong moment. I did not know riding into Duskwell that morning that I was about to make a choice that would change everything. The town square was not supposed to be on my list of places to stop. I had intended to go straight to the general store, conduct my business, and leave. But the noise reached me before I reached the store, and Dust slowed on his own without any instruction from me, because even horses understand that a crowd in a state of disturbance is worth approaching with caution. There were perhaps 40 people in the square. Some of them were shouting. Some of them were arguing. Some of them were simply standing with the particular posture of people who want to appear uninvolved while remaining close enough to hear everything. A heavy-set man in a canvas coat was doing most of the talking. His voice carried easily over the rest of the noise, and what it was saying was this, that 3 nights ago a group of armed raiders had descended on a Mescalero Apache encampment 12 miles north of Duskwell and driven off every horse in the tribal herd. 180 animals, gone between midnight and dawn without a single shot fired in resistance because the tribe had no warning and no time to organize. The heavy-set man said this with the practiced tone of someone delivering information rather than conveying concern. He was reporting a fact the way a man reports the weather. Then, before the crowd could respond, Sheriff Briggs stepped forward. I had not seen Briggs before that day, but I recognized his type immediately. He was a tall man with a thick mustache and the posture of someone who had been told many times that he looked authoritative and had decided to believe it. He held one hand up to quiet the square, and when the noise dropped, he spoke clearly and without hesitation. "This is a matter for the Apache to handle," he said. "It is not the business of this town, and it is not the business of this office. These people have their own ways of dealing with their disputes, and I would ask every one of you to remember that we have enough of our own concerns without taking on somebody else's." The crowd received this with the kind of murmur that meant most of them were relieved to be told they did not have to do anything. I sat on dust and listened, and I heard something underneath the words that most of the people in that square probably did not register because they were not trained to listen for it. Briggs was not dismissing the situation because he was indifferent. He was dismissing it because he had been told to. I had spent 8 years as a federal marshal, and before that 4 years as a territorial investigator, and in all that time I had learned one thing above most others: the difference between a man who does not care and a man who has been instructed not to care. They say similar things, but they do not sound the same. And then I heard the name of the man responsible: Virgil Tate. The heavy-set man said it off-handedly, like it was a piece of common knowledge, like everyone present already understood who Virgil Tate was and what his involvement meant. And from the reaction of the crowd, maybe they did. But I understood something about Virgil Tate that none of them did. I knew his face, I knew his voice, I knew the way he moved and the way he thought and the particular calibration of his cruelty. I knew these things because 4 years ago I had been the man assigned to bring him to justice for a crime that made the theft of 180 horses look like a minor offense, and I had failed. Not because I lacked the evidence, because I had been told to fail and I had not fought hard enough against that instruction. I sat on dust in the middle of the Duskwell town square and felt the weight of 4 years settle back onto my shoulders like a coat I had been carrying the whole time and simply chosen not to put on. I looked at the crowd. I looked at Briggs. I looked at the old man in the black vest standing at the edge of the gathering, watching everything and saying nothing. Then I looked at the road heading north toward the mountains. "Excuse me," I said to the heavy-set man. "Which way to Crimson Pass?" The man stared at me like I had asked for directions to the surface of the moon. "What business do you have at Crimson Pass, stranger?" "I need to find someone," I said. "Virgil Tate has 14 guns, the man said. "I know. You're one man." "I know that, too." He opened his mouth and then closed it again. Briggs was looking at me now, and the quality of his attention was different from what it had been when he was addressing the crowd. He was assessing, calculating. I noted this and filed it away. "North Road," the heavy-set man finally said. "Follow it until the terrain turns red. After that, you're on your own." I turned dust toward the North Road. Behind me, I heard the murmur of the crowd, and underneath it I thought I heard someone say quietly that I was riding toward my own grave. Maybe, but the difference between a grave and a destination is mostly a matter of which direction you're facing when you get there. I had been facing the wrong direction for 4 years. It was time to turn around. Here is what I did not say in that square, and what I had not said to anyone in the 4 years since it happened. My name is Caleb Morrow. I was a federal marshal in the New Mexico Territory until the autumn of 1879. Before that, I was a good one. I believed in the work. I believed that the law, imperfectly applied as it always is, was better than the absence of law. I believed that a man with a badge and a reasonable amount of courage could make a difference in a place that needed it. I believed a lot of things before the autumn of 1879. In September of that year, I was assigned to investigate a violent incident at a Mescalero Apache settlement called Running Creek, 30 miles east of Socorro. The details of what happened there were by the time I arrived partially obscured by time and by the particular difficulty of gathering testimony in a place where most of the witnesses were dead. But not all of them. I will get to that later. What I found in 6 weeks of investigation was a clear and documentable chain of evidence pointing to one man as the architect of the violence at Running Creek. That man was Virgil Tate, operating under contract to a senior military officer named Norton, who wanted the land the settlement occupied for a purpose I did not immediately understand and was not immediately able to prove. I built the case carefully. I documented everything. I was prepared to file. And then Marshal Gideon Holt, my commanding officer, called me into his office and told me that the case was being closed. I told him it was not finished. He told me it was. I told him I would not sign a closure order without proper adjudication. He told me that I would or I would no longer be a marshal. I did not sign. I was dismissed from service the following morning. The case was closed that same afternoon under Holt's signature. Norton faced no inquiry. Tate was never charged. And I spent the next 4 years doing nothing about it because I had told myself that there was nothing to be done and that the fault lay with the system and not with me, and that my refusal to sign had been an act of integrity. It had been. It had also been insufficient. Those two things can both be true at the same time. It took me a long time to understand that. I made camp that night in a narrow canyon about 8 miles north of Duskwell, where the red rock walls rose on either side and the wind moved through in a low, continuous sound that was almost like a voice. Dust drank from a thin stream, and I built a fire small enough to be invisible from the road, and I sat with my back against the canyon wall and took the old badge out of my coat pocket. It was not a badge I was authorized to carry anymore. It had been returned to the marshal's office the morning after I was dismissed. But I had been given another one months later by a different commanding officer in a different jurisdiction who did not know my history, and when I left that position, I kept it. Not out of dishonesty, out of something I could not quite name and had spent a long time trying not to examine too closely. I held it in the firelight and turned it over in my hand. The metal was worn smooth along the edges. It caught the light and threw it back in pieces. I had carried this thing for 4 years and told myself it was a reminder of what I had once been, of what the job had asked of me, and what I had been willing to give. Of the moment I had refused to sign my name to a lie, which was the last unambiguously right thing I could remember doing. What I had not let myself say until that night in the canyon was this: refusing to sign was not enough. It had never been enough. Integrity without action is just a comfortable way to watch things burn from a safe distance. I sat with that thought for a long time. Then I heard something behind me. It was not the wind. It was not the horse. It was the specific quality of silence that exists in a space where something living has stopped moving because it wants you to not notice that it is there. I did not reach for my rifle. I did not stand up. "I know you're there," I said to the fire. Nothing for a moment. Then the sound of footsteps on rock, deliberate now, not bothering with concealment. A woman stepped into the light of the fire. She was 26 years old, though I did not know that yet. She wore a traveling coat over traditional clothing, and her hair was long and dark and tied back simply, and she moved with the kind of ease that belongs to people who have spent a great deal of time outdoors and have stopped thinking about it. She had no visible weapon in her hands, though I noticed immediately that her coat had 2 pockets and that her right hand was resting close to one of them. She was Mescalero Apache. I knew this not from any single feature, but from the combination of things: the clothing, the way she held herself, the fact that she had tracked me from Duskwell to this canyon in the dark, without making a sound, until she chose to. Her eyes were dark and direct, and they did not ask permission before they assessed you. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Dust, standing at the edge of the firelight with his ears forward. "You left town heading north," she said. Her English was clean and precise, the kind that comes from formal instruction rather than casual exposure. "You asked for directions to Crimson Pass." "I did." "Why?" "I told the man in the square, I need to find someone." "You told him you needed to find someone. You did not tell him who." "No," I agreed. She moved a few steps to the side, not closer to me, not farther away, just repositioning herself so that the fire was not directly between us. It was a tactically sound adjustment. I noted it without comment. "My name is Nora Swiftwind," she said. "Those were my people's horses." I looked at her across the fire. The light moved between us, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "I'm sorry," I said. "That is a word," she said. "It doesn't bring the horses back." "No, it doesn't." She studied me again, and whatever she was looking for, she did not appear to find enough of it to satisfy her. She moved to a flat rock on the other side of the fire and sat down, which I took to mean that she was not leaving immediately. "Why are you going to Crimson Pass?" she asked again. "I have a reason." "A reason you won't share?" "Not yet." She was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Somewhere up in the canyon walls, something small moved in the dark, and then was still. "I grew up near these mountains," she said. "I know every approach to Crimson Pass. I know where the water is and where the ground is unstable, and where a man on horseback can move without being seen from the high ground." "That's useful knowledge," I said. "You don't have it." "No, I do. And you know something about Virgil Tate that you haven't told anyone." She paused. "I watched your face when his name was said in the square. You knew something. You have history with him." I looked at her for a long time. In my experience, there are two kinds of people who are exceptionally good at reading others. The first kind are liars who have trained themselves to watch for the small signals that tell them when their deception is working. The second kind are survivors who have learned to read people quickly because the cost of misreading them was once too high to bear. Nora Swiftwind was the second kind. "We would be useful to each other," she said. "That is all I am proposing. I am not asking you to trust me. I am not offering you my trust. I am suggesting that two people with different information and different skills moving toward the same objective are more likely to succeed than one." I considered this. "I don't have a comfortable camp," I said, "and I wasn't expecting company." "I have my own bedroll," she said. I fed another branch to the fire. "All right," I said. She nodded once with the efficiency of someone who had not been expecting resistance and was not particularly moved by the absence of it. We sat across from each other in the narrow canyon, and the fire burned down slowly, and the night settled around us with the particular weight of desert silence in the small hours. I did not sleep well. I rarely did. But that night I lay with my back to the rock and stared at the canyon walls above me and thought about Running Creek and about Virgil Tate and about the case that had ended my career and the 4 years I had spent afterward telling myself it was enough to have refused. In the morning, when the light came gray and thin over the eastern rim of the canyon, I got up before Nora and found her already awake, crouched by the remains of the fire with a tin cup in her hands, looking east. I went to check Dust's hobble, and when I came back, Nora was standing and looking at the saddle. She was looking at the name stamped into the leather. I had done that myself years ago with a letter stamp and a small hammer. The letters were shallow but legible. Dust, and below it smaller C. Morrow, USM, United States Marshal. Nora did not say anything immediately. She kept her eyes on the name, and the quality of her stillness was different from a moment before. Something had changed in her. I watched her read it. I watched her understand what it meant. And I watched the change move through her face, not dramatically, not with any performance, but the way a light changes in a room when a cloud passes over the sun. When she turned to look at me, the openness that had been in her expression the night before was gone. "Caleb Morrow," she said. "United States Marshal. Former. You were the investigator assigned to Running Creek 4 years ago." It was not a question. "You found evidence against Virgil Tate, and then you closed the case." The canyon was very quiet. The morning wind had not yet started, and Dust was still, and there was nothing between her words and the air. "I didn't close it," I said. "My commanding officer closed it. I refused to sign." The result was the same. "Yes," I said. "It was." She looked at me for a long moment. I did not look away because there was nothing in her gaze that I had not already said to myself in the dark in various forms on various nights over the past 4 years. She was not showing me anything new. She was just showing it to me plainly without the softening I had given it in my own head. My village had 23 people in it, she said. 21 of them died that night. I survived because I was at the river. I had a child with me, my nephew. He was 1 year old. She paused. His father, my brother, pushed us toward the water before he ran back to help the others. He did not come back out. She said this without any particular inflection, not because it did not matter to her, because it mattered so much that it had moved beyond the register of tone and into something harder and quieter. The child is 5 years old now, she said. He lives with the tribe. Every night before he sleeps he asks me where his father's horse is. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been worth the air it took to say it. Morning, she said. The horse's name is Morning. It is a white horse, and it was my brother's, and it is somewhere in that herd that Virgil Tate took 3 nights ago. She picked up her bedroll and tied it efficiently without looking at me. I am still going to Crimson Pass, she said. The terms of the arrangement I proposed last night have not changed. You have information I need. I have knowledge you lack. We are useful to each other. She paused with her hand on the strap of her roll and looked back at me. But I want you to understand something clearly, Caleb Morrow. I am not doing this because I have forgiven you. I am doing this because forgiving you is not the point. The horses are the point. Mourning is the point, and Virgil Tate being made to answer for what he did is the point. I understand, I said. Do you? Yes. She held my gaze for another moment. Then she turned and began to saddle her horse with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been doing it since childhood. I looked down at the badge in my hand. I had taken it out in the night without thinking the way you reach for something familiar when the dark gets heavy. I turned it over once. Then I put it in my coat pocket. We left the canyon as the sun cleared the eastern peaks and turned the desert floor from gray to the color of old copper. Nora rode slightly ahead because she knew the terrain and I did not, and because I suspected she was not ready to ride beside me. I did not push. I had no right to push. I rode behind her and watched the mountains grow larger in front of us and thought about a 5-year-old boy who asked every night about his father's horse. I had been telling myself for 4 years that I had done what I could, that refusing to sign had been the limit of what was in my power, that the fault belonged to Holt and to Norton and to the system that had made their instructions possible. All of that was true, and none of it had ever been the whole truth. Because the whole truth was this: I had done what was convenient to call courage, and I had called it enough, and 21 people were dead, and a white horse named Morning was in a stolen herd somewhere in the Red Mountains ahead of me, and a boy of 5 was still waiting for it to come home. I rode north into the rising heat of the New Mexico morning, and I did not look back at the canyon. There was nothing back there worth looking at anymore. Dust carried me steadily the way he always had. His hooves found the ground without complaint on the loose stone and the packed sand and the dry creek beds that cut across the path at irregular intervals. He did not need guidance on terrain like this. He had been over enough rough ground to know how to read it. I thought about what Nora had said. The terms are unchanged. We are useful to each other. It was the most honest basis for cooperation I had encountered in a long time. No promises of friendship, no pretense of understanding. Just 2 people with different pieces of the same problem moving toward the same place for different reasons that happened to point in the same direction. I could work with that. I had worked with less. What I had not yet told her, and what she did not yet know, was the full shape of what I had found 4 years ago in the records and the testimony and the land surveys that surrounded the Running Creek case. I knew more than just Virgil Tate's involvement. I knew who had given Tate his orders. I knew why, and I knew or suspected with a certainty that had only grown stronger in the years since that the evidence I had gathered then was not the only evidence that existed. Norton was a careful man. Careful men kept records. They kept records because they knew that the day might come when they needed to prove that the order had come from somewhere above them. If Norton was at Crimson Pass, and if he had come there for the reason I suspected, there was a chance that whatever he was carrying with him would be worth more than the horses. I did not say this to Nora yet. It was not the right time. But I thought about it as we rode, and I thought about the old judge in his black vest standing silent at the edge of the crowd, and I thought about what it would mean if the third name on that order, the one above Holt's and Norton's, belonged to someone who was still in a position of power in this territory. By the time we stopped at midday to rest the horses at a thin creek under a cluster of cottonwoods, I had made myself a promise. I had kept quiet once because I had been told to, and because I had convinced myself that the gesture of refusal was sufficient, and because, if I am honest, I had been afraid of what fighting harder would cost me. I was not going to make that mistake again. Not this time. Nora watered her horse in silence, and then sat on a flat rock with her back to the mountains and her face to the south, and she looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had decided that the only way forward was to keep carrying it. I sat downstream and gave her the space. After a while she said without turning around, "How far? From here maybe 4 hours to the base of the pass. We should wait for dark before we go higher." "I know," she said. "I wasn't asking about the distance." I thought about what she was asking instead. "I don't know how far," I said honestly, "but I'm not stopping until it's finished." She was quiet for a moment. "My brother's name was Thomas," she said. "Thomas Swiftwind. He was 30 years old when he died. He could ride a horse better than anyone I have ever seen before or since. He used to say that a man and his horse are the same animal, they just wear different faces." She turned around and looked at me across the water. "Morning was his horse from the time it was born. They grew up together." I held her gaze. "I'm going to bring Morning home," I said. She looked at me for a long time, not with softness, not with forgiveness, but with something that had not been there yesterday, a kind of provisional acknowledgement, the look of someone who has decided to wait and see rather than dismiss outright. "You'd better," she said, and she turned back toward the south, and we sat in the cottonwood shade while the horses drank, and the afternoon heat pressed down on the desert, and somewhere ahead of us beyond the red mountains, the work that should have been done 4 years ago was waiting to be finished. I was not the same man who had failed to finish it then. I was not certain I was a better man, but I was a man with nothing left to protect except the chance to do this one thing right. And sometimes that is enough. We rode through the afternoon in the particular silence that exists between two people who have said important things and are still deciding what to do with them. The terrain changed as we moved north. The flat scrubland gave way to broken ground, shallow arroyos cutting across the path at angles that forced us to pick our way carefully, and the red sandstone formations began to appear in earnest, rising out of the desert floor in shapes that looked deliberate, like something had arranged them there with a specific intention that no one had yet figured out. The color of the rock deepened as the sun moved west, going from the pale orange of midday to something richer and darker, closer to the color of old blood. Dust moved steadily beneath me. He was a horse who understood long days, who had learned somewhere in his 14 years that the work was the work, and that complaining about it changed nothing. I had always appreciated that about him. In the years since I left the Marshal Service, when I had very little that could reasonably be called direction or purpose, his steadiness had been one of the few constants I could count on. Nora rode ahead of me, following a line through the terrain that was not a road, and was not a trail in any formal sense, but was clearly a route she knew, a sequence of landmarks and turns that she navigated without hesitation or reference. She had grown up in this landscape. It was in her body the way a language is in the body, not something you think about, but something you simply do. I watched her ride and thought about what she had told me at the creek. Thomas Swiftwind, 30 years old, a man who could ride better than anyone she had ever seen, a man who had pushed his sister and his infant nephew toward the water before running back into the fire, and who had not come out, a 5-year-old boy who asked every night about his father's horse. I had been carrying the weight of Running Creek for 4 years in the abstract, in the form of professional failure and moral compromise and the low-grade shame of a man who knows he did not do enough. But those were my terms, my categories, the weight as it applied to me. Nora had given me the weight as it actually was. She had given me Thomas in mourning and a child named Roy, who was growing up without a father because of a sequence of decisions that I had been part of and had not fought hard enough to stop. I did not say any of this out loud. There was nothing to say that would not have sounded like a further imposition, another version of making her story about my feelings. The least I could do was carry it quietly and let it be what it was. Around mid-afternoon, Nora stopped her horse at the crest of a low rise and held up one hand. I came up beside her and followed her gaze. Below us, the terrain opened briefly into a shallow basin before rising again sharply toward the red rock formations that marked the beginning of Crimson Pass proper. The basin was maybe a quarter-mile across, dry and pale, cut through the middle by a dry creek bed that would run full in the rainy season and was now just a pale scar in the ground. And at the far edge of the basin, half hidden against the base of the first red cliff, there was a structure, low and improvised, built from timber and canvas and what looked like salvaged fence rails, but large enough to hold a significant number of animals. A corral. I counted what I could see from our position. The late afternoon light made it difficult, but there was movement inside the structure, the shifting of large bodies, the occasional flash of color. "How many?" I said quietly. "I cannot count them from here, but that is the right size." Nora's voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. "That is where they are." I looked at the basin for a long moment. The corral was set against the cliff face on one side, which limited approach angles. There were two structures that looked like sleeping tents on the eastern side, and a larger structure, more permanent, that might have been a cook tent or a headquarters of some kind. Then I saw the other thing. On the western edge of the camp, half in shadow, there was a vehicle that did not belong with the rest of it. It was a coach. Not a working ranch wagon or a freight hauler, but an actual coach, the kind with finished wood paneling and a folding step and brass fittings on the door. The kind that costs more than most men in this territory earn in 2 years. It was dusty from the road, but the quality of it was unmistakable even at this distance. And on the side panel, just visible in the angle of the late light, there was a marking. A crest of some kind. Official. Military. Nora saw it at the same moment I did. She said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then she said, "That is Brigadier General Norton's coach." I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature. "You're certain?" I said. "I saw that coach in Santa Fe 4 years ago," she said. "When I was at the mission school. Norton came to speak with the administrators. I remember the crest on the door because I looked it up afterward. I wanted to know who he was." She paused. "I already knew his name from the investigation. From what you found." "He's not here to visit Tate," I said. "No, he is not." I understood then fully what I had been partially understanding since the moment I heard Tate's name in the Duskwell town square. This was not a straightforward theft. It was not a criminal operation that existed in isolation from the larger structures of power in this territory. Virgil Tate was not the architect of anything. He was a tool. He had always been a tool in the Running Creek business, and in this, a man with capacity for violence and without the imagination to question whose purposes that violence was serving. Norton was here because something had changed. Something had shifted in whatever long-term plan he had been executing, and he had come to Crimson Pass to manage it personally, which meant either that the situation had become complicated enough to require his direct attention, or that he was preparing to eliminate the complication. Tate was the complication. I did not say this to Nora yet because I was not entirely certain of it, and because I wanted to think through the implications before I spoke. We moved back from the crest and made a cold camp in a shallow depression behind the ridgeline where we could not be seen from the basin below. No fire. Water from our canteens. We ate what we had without tasting it and spoke in low voices while the sun went down and the desert temperature dropped with the speed it always does in high desert country, quickly and without transition, like a door closing. "Tell me everything," Nora said. It was not a question. I looked at my hands in the near darkness and tried to find the cleanest way into the story. There was no clean way. There was just the truth in the order it had happened. In September of 1879, I said, I was assigned to investigate the incident at Running Creek. By the time I arrived on the scene, 3 weeks had passed and most of the physical evidence had degraded or been removed. But I had testimony from people in the surrounding area, and I had land records, and I had a sequence of communications that taken together pointed clearly to Tate as the man who had led the raid. "I know this part," Nora said. "I know you do, but let me say it out loud, because the part I have not said out loud is what comes after, and I think I need to arrive at it properly." She was quiet. I took that as permission. What I found beyond Tate was a chain of authorization. Tate did not act independently. He was contracted. He was paid, and he was given a specific objective, which was to drive the Running Creek settlement off that land by any means necessary. The contract was verbal, not written, but the money transfer was documented, and I found the record of it. Who paid him? It came through an intermediary, a land agent in Socorro named Caldwell, who has since left the territory. But the funds originated from a military discretionary account under Norton's command. I traced it far enough to establish the connection beyond reasonable doubt. Nora was very still. "Norton wanted the Running Creek land," I continued. "The reason, as best I could determine at the time, was that the territory was planning a new garrison installation and that stretch of the Jemez foothills was the preferred location. The land was Mescalero territory under an informal agreement that nobody in the military wanted to formally acknowledge, because acknowledging it would have required going through federal negotiation processes that would have taken years. So instead they burned it," Nora said. The two words sat in the air between us. "Instead, they burned it," I said. And when I had built the case and was prepared to file, my commanding officer, Marshal Gideon Holt, told me the investigation was over. Why, what did Holt get out of protecting Norton? I did not know the answer to that at the time. I have had 4 years to think about it, and my best understanding now is that Holt's cooperation was not purchased but compelled. Norton had something on him. What exactly, I never found out. But the speed with which Holt shut the case down and the fact that he did it himself rather than going through the standard closure procedures suggested to me that he was not acting from greed but from fear. That does not change what happened. No, it doesn't. I was quiet for a moment. When I refused to sign the closure order, Holt dismissed me from service. He signed the closure himself. I left the office that night thinking I had done the right thing, that my refusal was a matter of record, that if the truth ever came out, it would be clear that I had not participated in the cover-up. I stopped. Nora waited. "What I did not do," I said, "was find another way to bring it forward. I could have gone to the press. I could have contacted the federal civilian courts directly. I could have found the survivors of Running Creek and helped them file a complaint through channels that did not run through Holt. I could have done many things. But you did none of them." I told myself the evidence was not enough without the official case file, which was now closed and sealed. I told myself I was one man without institutional support, that fighting Norton and Holt together was beyond what was possible. I told myself that I had done what I could. The desert around us was very quiet. In the distance a coyote called once and then went silent. "I believed it," I said. "At the time I believed it was true, and maybe some of it was, but not all of it. The part that was not true was this: I was afraid, not of physical harm, of the cost, of spending years fighting a battle I might lose, of becoming the kind of man who is defined entirely by one lost cause, of sacrificing whatever remained of my life to something that might change nothing." I looked at Nora. I chose to preserve what was left of myself instead of spending it on the fight. And 21 people stayed dead, and mourning stayed ungiven back. And Roy grew up without a father, asking every night where his father's horse was. The silence after I finished was long and complete. Nora sat with her knees drawn up and her arms folded and looked at the dark ground between us. Her face was not readable in the darkness. I did not try to read it. After a while she said, without looking up, "I spent 3 years at the mission school in Santa Fe. The priests who ran it were not cruel men. They were men who believed that what they were doing was correct and necessary, that they were improving the people who passed through their doors. They were wrong in a way that caused significant harm, but they were not lying when they said they believed it. She paused. I used to think that the men who burned Running Creek were different from those priests, that there was a meaningful distinction between people who cause harm through genuine conviction and people who cause harm through deliberate choice. But I have come to think that the distinction matters less than I once believed. The harm is the same. The people it falls on do not experience it differently depending on the motivation. No, I said, they don't. What I am saying is this. She looked up. I understand the difference between what you did and what Norton and Tate did. I am not equating them, but I am also not going to tell you that your reasons make it smaller than it was, because they don't. And I think you know that. I do, I said. Good. She uncurled slightly. Then we understand each other. We did not say anything more for a long time after that. The moon came up eventually and spread a pale light across the basin below us, and somewhere in that light, in the improvised corral against the red cliff, 180 horses were waiting, and somewhere in among them a white horse named Morning was standing in the dark, not knowing that anyone was coming. I thought about Roy. I thought about a child asking a question every night that no one had been able to answer, and about the particular cruelty of a loss that is not just loss but theft, the removal of something that should have been there, that had a name and a face and hoof prints in the dirt. I was going to bring Morning home. That was not sentiment. That was a fact I had decided, and I intended to make it true. I looked at Nora in the moonlight. She was looking at the basin. There is something else, I said. Tell me. Norton is here for a reason. He does not travel to places like this without a reason. My belief is that he is here to close out his association with Tate, to ensure there is no surviving record of the relationship between them. Nora was very still. He is going to kill Tate, she said, or give the order for it. Yes, I think so. And when he is done here, he will return to Santa Fe with whatever documentation he has been carrying that connects him to the original land scheme, and it will disappear into whatever safe place he has been keeping it, and there will be nothing left to tie him to Running Creek or to this. Unless we get that documentation first. Yes. She thought about this. The horses and the documents are in different locations, she said. Almost certainly. Norton would not store sensitive materials in a common area. He would keep them close to himself in the large structure or in the coach. Then we need to split the tasks. She looked at me directly. I will get the horses out. You will go for the documents. You know the terrain well enough to move a herd of that size in the dark. My people have been moving horses through these mountains at night since before your country existed, she said. It was not said with heat. It was simply a fact. Yes, I know how. I accepted this. There is something else we need to address, she said, before we go in. The guard situation. Not exactly. She shifted, looking toward the camp below. When I was watching the camp earlier, I noticed one of the figures standing watch on the western perimeter. He was not moving the way Tate's men move. He was wearing a different kind of coat, military cut. Norton's man. Yes, but young. 19, maybe 20. He was standing very far from the others. He kept looking toward the exit of the valley. He was not where he wanted to be. I looked at her. You want to approach him, I said. Not want, need. She was clear about the distinction. If we go into that camp with someone on that western perimeter who is alert and motivated, the margin for error disappears. But a man who does not want to be there is not the same as a man who is committed to what he is guarding. He is a problem that might be solved without violence. It's a risk. Everything about tonight is a risk. This particular risk has a possible upside that the others don't. She paused. I know how to talk to someone who is trapped somewhere they did not choose. I have some experience with that situation. The way she said it was not dramatic. It was just accurate. She had spent 3 years at a school she had not chosen to attend, learning a language and a set of conventions imposed on her, navigating a world that had decided what she should become before she arrived. She knew what it felt like to stand watch over your own captivity. If the young soldier was anything like what she was describing, she might be exactly the right person to reach him. "All right," I said. "You take the western perimeter. I'll wait until you signal, then go for the documents and the corral gate." "What is the signal?" "2 short calls, like a nighthawk." She nodded. We were quiet for a moment. "Nora," I said. She looked at me. "If something goes wrong, if at any point the operation is compromised and you have to choose between completing it and getting clear, you get clear. Roy needs you home." She held my gaze for a long moment. "The same applies to you," she said, "though I recognize you believe you have less to come home to. I'm working on changing that." Something shifted in her expression. Not warmly, not yet, but the wall that had been absolute since the moment she read the name on the saddle had developed something in it, not a crack exactly, but a place where the stone was slightly less solid than the rest. "Roy asked me last week," she said quietly, "whether a person can be both a bad person and a good person at the same time. He is 5 years old, and he asked this question with complete seriousness. What did you tell him?" "I told him I was still working out the answer." She stood and began to prepare her gear. "Perhaps by the time tonight is over I will have one." She moved down the back slope of the ridge in the darkness, and I sat and waited and watched the moon move across the sky above the red mountains. I thought about what she had said to Roy, whether a person can be both. I did not have an answer either. But I thought about the badge in my pocket worn smooth along the edges, and about the fact that I was here, and that being here was at least a different choice than the ones I had made before. It was not enough in any accounting of what I owed. It would never be enough in that sense. But it was what tonight offered, and tonight was what I had. The camp below us settled into a different rhythm as the night deepened. The fire in the center burned lower, and the movement around it became less frequent, and by the time the moon was fully up, most of the figures I could count had disappeared into the sleeping tents on the eastern side. 2 remained visible near the large central structure. A third moved occasionally along the northern perimeter in a slow, irregular pattern that suggested boredom more than vigilance. And on the western edge, exactly where Nora had indicated, a single figure stood alone. I watched him from the ridge for a long time. He was young. Even at this distance, in this light, I could tell that from the way he stood, from the particular restlessness of someone who has not yet learned to be still, who moves their weight from foot to foot, and looks in too many directions too quickly because they have not yet made peace with the act of waiting. He was not where he wanted to be. I thought about what Nora had said, that she knew how to talk to someone who was trapped somewhere they had not chosen, that she had experience with that situation. I had not fully considered until that moment what it had cost her to spend 3 years at the mission school in Santa Fe. She had said it without complaint, almost in passing, as a piece of relevant context. But 3 years is a long time. 3 years in a place that had decided in advance who you were supposed to become, surrounded by people whose benevolence was inseparable from their certainty that they knew better than you about your own life. She had come back from that and built herself into what she was now. That was not a small thing. That was, if I was honest about it, more than most people manage under far easier circumstances. I heard the nighthawk call a few minutes before midnight. 2 short notes, clean and precise. I moved. The approach from the north was the one I had planned during the hours of watching. There was a natural fold in the terrain, a low depression running roughly east to west that would carry me within 50 yards of the large central structure before I would need to move in the open. From there, the shadows cast by the coach would provide partial cover. I moved slowly. Not because I was afraid, though I was, but because speed is the enemy of silence, and silence was the only asset I had on my side. I had left the rifle with dust. It was too long and too loud for what I needed tonight. I carried only my belt knife and the knowledge of what I was looking for. The ground was hard and dry under my hands and knees, the way desert ground is compacted and slightly cold from the night air, with occasional loose stones that had to be identified and worked around rather than displaced. I had done this kind of movement before in the years when I was active, and the body remembers it even when years have passed, the specific distribution of weight that keeps any single point of contact from bearing enough to make a sound. I reached the shadow of the coach and stopped. The large central structure was 15 feet away. The canvas side facing me had been rolled partially up to allow for ventilation, and through the gap I could see the glow of a lantern turned low, and beneath the lantern the surface of a camp table, and on the table the particular organized disarray of a man who works with documents. Norton. He was not asleep. He was sitting with his back to me, bent over the table, doing something with his hands that I could not see clearly. He was a large man, broad in the shoulders, with white hair, close cut against his skull. He moved with the deliberate economy of someone who has spent decades in command positions, someone who has learned to conserve energy for the moments that require it. I watched him for 2 full minutes, timing the movement of the guards I could still track, calculating the window. Then I moved to the back of the structure and found what I was looking for. A military field chest, the kind used for secure document transport, was stored under the camp table, half hidden behind a canvas bag. It was locked, but the lock was a standard military pattern that I had encountered many times in my years of service, and I had in my coat pocket a small folding tool that I had carried since my first year as a marshal for reasons exactly like this one. I was working on the lock when Norton moved. He stood from the table, stretching his back, and turned toward the lantern to adjust the wick, and in doing so, he brought himself to face the back wall of the structure, and I had approximately 3 seconds to become invisible behind the canvas before he would have a clear line of sight to my position. I went flat against the exterior wall and did not breathe. The lantern light shifted. I heard him exhale a long, controlled breath, the kind of sound a man makes when he is alone and tired and not yet ready to sleep. I heard the creak of the camp chair taking his weight again. I waited another 30 seconds. Then I finished the lock. The chest opened without resistance. Inside there were 3 things: a leather-bound ledger, a folded map with annotations in a precise hand, and a set of correspondence, perhaps 20 pages folded together and tied with a cord. I took the correspondence first and scanned it by the thin edge of moonlight coming through the gap in the canvas wall. The first letter was in Holt's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. I had spent 8 years receiving orders in that handwriting, and even in poor light, after 4 years it was unmistakable. The letter was dated October 1879, 1 month after Running Creek. It was addressed to Norton, and it read in the measured language of official correspondence as a formal confirmation of closure of the Running Creek investigation and a guarantee of continued discretion. The second letter was Norton's response. The third letter was not from Holt. I held it closer to the gap in the canvas and read the signature at the bottom: Judge Harlan Price, Duskwell, New Mexico Territory. I stood very still in the dark for a moment that felt much longer than it was. The old man in the black vest, standing at the edge of the crowd, watching everything and saying nothing. Quiet men in positions of power are not quiet because they have nothing to say. I read enough of the letter to understand its nature. It was not an operational document. It was not an order or an authorization. It was a personal communication written in the careful language of a man who understood that what he was putting on paper could be used against him, but who needed to communicate nonetheless. It referenced obliquely but unmistakably his awareness of the Running Creek operation and his commitment to ensuring that any legal proceedings arising from it would be managed appropriately at the local level. Judge Price had not ordered the burning of Running Creek. He had simply been the guarantee that if anything went wrong, the local courts would not be a problem. He had been the insurance policy. And he was sitting in a courtroom in Duskwell right now waiting to render a verdict on a man who had just read his name in a letter hidden under a camp table in the New Mexico desert. I folded the correspondence and placed it inside my coat against my chest. I closed the chest and reset the lock and moved back out the way I had come. I did not think about what I had found. I did not have time to think about it. I filed it in the part of my mind that stores things for later and concentrated on the ground in front of me and the guards I needed to track and the next 50 yards between me and the corral. From across the camp, just barely audible, I heard something. A voice, Nora's, low and clear, and then a younger voice, uncertain, asking a question. And then silence. And then from the western perimeter the slow groan of a gate hinge. I ran. Not the careful movement of approach, but actual running, covering the ground between myself and the corral with everything I had, because the window was measured in seconds now, and every second was a horse that might not make it out. I reached the corral from the north side and found the main gate already partially open. Nora was inside. She was moving through the herd in a way I had never seen, without hesitation or urgency, touching necks and flanks with the flat of her hand, making a sound low in her throat that was not quite a word and not quite a song, but that the animals clearly recognized. They were shifting, orienting their energy, beginning to consolidate in the direction of the open gate. Then I saw her stop. In the middle of the herd, pale as moonlight on water, a white horse stood looking at her. Morning. She stood in front of him for a moment that lasted exactly as long as it needed, to her hand against his face, her forehead briefly touching his. She did not make a sound. Neither did he. Then she turned and walked to the front of the herd, and Morning followed her, and behind him the other horses began to move. I swung the gate wide and stood aside. They came out like water finding a channel, not panicked, not stampeding, moving in the purposeful way of animals that understand they are going somewhere, guided by Nora at the front, and by some collective understanding I could not fully explain. I counted without being able to fully count, the numbers not mattering in that moment as much as the movement, the fact of them moving, the direction of the thing, having finally turned toward something right after 4 years of facing the wrong way. The last horse cleared the gate. From the sleeping tents on the eastern side someone shouted. I looked back toward the large central structure and saw the lantern light move, and then Norton was at the entrance, and behind him, coming from a different direction, was Virgil Tate. And then the night, which had been controlled and careful up until that moment, stopped being either of those things. I did not wait. I turned north and ran after the horses, and behind me the camp came awake in the chaotic and loud way that camps come awake when something important has gone wrong, and somewhere in the darkness ahead of me, Nora was leading 180 horses home, including one white horse named Morning. And in my coat, folded against my chest, was a set of letters that were going to change everything, if I made it through the night to use them. I ran north through the dark, with the sound of the camp erupting behind me, and the letters folded against my chest, and nothing in front of me but desert and moonlight and the fading sound of hooves on hard ground. The horses were already 100 yards ahead, moving in the consolidated way that Nora had organized them, a dark mass flowing through the basin toward the northern exit, where the red rock walls narrowed and then opened again onto the long slope that led down toward Mescalero country. I could not see Nora in the darkness, but I could track the movement of the herd, and I knew she was at the front of it, doing whatever she was doing that kept them moving in the right direction without panic. Behind me, the noise was organized enough to tell me that Tate's men were not simply confused. They were responding. I could hear Tate's voice above the others, not the words but the cadence of command, someone who had been in situations like this before and knew how to direct people through them. I gave them 3 minutes before they had horses of their own, because no operation of this kind runs without a reserve string, and Tate was too experienced to have left himself without a way to pursue. 3 minutes was not much time. I pushed harder across the basin floor, and the loose ground tried to take my footing, and I kept my eyes on the dark shapes ahead of me and did not look back. Then I heard Tate's voice again, but different this time, closer than it should have been, and from a direction that did not match the camp behind me, from my left. I threw myself to the ground a half-second before the shot, and I felt the air of it pass above me with the particular quality that gunfire has when it misses close, a sound and a pressure both at once that your body understands before your mind does. I rolled right, came up on my hands and knees, changed direction. Tate had sent men around the perimeter. He had anticipated the northern exit and positioned someone to cut it off. It was exactly what I would have done, and I had not planned for it because I had been thinking about Norton and the documents and had underestimated the operational competence of a man I had spent 4 years regarding primarily as a criminal. That was a mistake I could not afford to repeat. I changed course and went east away from the direct line to the herd exit, buying distance from wherever the shot had come from. The eastern side of the basin ran up against the cliff face and was full of broken rock and shadow, bad ground for a pursuit but equally bad for me. I moved through it as quickly as I dared, testing each footfall before committing my weight, keeping low. I heard 2 men behind me now. Not running, moving carefully, which meant they had lost visual contact and were working by sound. I went still behind a boulder the size of a wagon wheel and slowed my breathing to something that would not carry. 10 seconds. 20. The footsteps moved past me at a distance of perhaps 30 feet, heading northeast. I waited until they faded, then moved in the opposite direction back west, curving around the southern edge of the camp toward the position I had left Dust. I had not planned to go back for the horse. I had told Dust to stay, had left him hobbled in the depression north of the ridge, and my intention had been to rejoin him after the operation was complete. But the operation had not gone the way I had planned, and the northern exit was compromised, and without a horse I was a man on foot in open desert being pursued by mounted men, which is not a situation with favorable mathematics. I moved along the base of the ridge, staying in the shadow line where the moonlight did not reach, and I found the depression and found Dust exactly where I had left him, ears forward, watching my approach with the expression of a horse who had heard considerable noise in the recent past and had decided that waiting was the appropriate response. I pulled the hobble and mounted in one movement, and Dust was already moving before I had my seat properly, because 14 years had given him an understanding of when urgency was required. I took him east along the ridge line away from the direct pursuit, climbing the broken slope toward the high ground that looked down over the basin from the north. From up there I would be able to see the full situation. I needed to know where Nora was. I needed to know if the herd had cleared the northern exit or been turned back by Tate's men. The climb took longer than I wanted it to. The ground was steep and loose in places, and Dust picked his way carefully, refusing to be hurried on terrain he did not trust, which was the right call, but a frustrating one when every minute counted. We reached the high point, and I pulled him to a stop and looked down. The basin was lit by moonlight and by 2 torches that someone in the camp had lit, throwing moving orange light across the ground below. I could see 4 mounted men on the northern side, 2 of them near the exit, 2 working east along the far wall. The herd was not visible. Either it had made the exit before Tate's men got there, or it had been turned and scattered somewhere in the dark ground to the north. I could not tell which. Then I saw something that changed the shape of everything. At the camp's center, between the sleeping tents and the large structure, 2 men were standing facing each other in the torchlight. Virgil Tate and Norton. They were not standing the way allies stand. They were standing the way men stand when the agreement between them has reached its end, and both of them know it. Tate had one hand near his belt. Norton's hands were at his sides, but his posture had the specific quality of a man who is in the middle of a calculation. I had seen this before. Not this exact configuration, but this exact moment. The moment when a powerful man decides that the person who has been useful to him has become a liability instead, and makes the internal decision to act on that assessment. Norton had come to Crimson Pass to close out his association with Tate. I had understood that from the beginning. What I had not fully worked through was the timeline. I had assumed he would wait until the immediate situation, the stolen horses, the risk of investigation, had resolved itself. I had assumed he would be patient, but the horses were gone now. The camp was compromised. And a careful, experienced man in Norton's position, faced with a collapsing operation and an associate who knew enough to destroy him, does not wait. Norton moved first. He had a smaller weapon, a short-barreled revolver that had been in his right hand longer than I realized, held along his thigh, where the angle of the torchlight had hidden it. He raised it and fired once, and Tate went down. Not dead. I could see the movement from the ridge, the way Tate's body was responding. Shoulder or arm, still alive but down, and down meant controllable. Norton looked at the fallen man for a moment. Then he looked up. Not at me. He could not have seen me at this distance in this light. but he looked up toward the ridgeline with the instinct of someone who has been in enough situations to know that high ground is always worth accounting for. Then he bent down and said something to Tate, and then he turned toward the large structure, and I understood that he was going back for the documents, which he was about to discover were no longer there. I put my heels to dust. Not down the slope I had come up, which was too slow, but along the ridgeline to the west, where the angle was less severe following the contour until the ground flattened enough to descend at speed. Dust found his footing and I let him run, trusting his judgment on the terrain, keeping my weight back and my balance centered. We came off the ridge at the western end, and I pointed Dust at the camp entrance, and he covered the ground between with everything he had left, which was still considerable for a horse who had spent 14 years deciding that forward was always the right direction. I came into the camp from the west at speed and pulled Dust hard to the left to avoid the nearest tent, and came around the side of the large structure and dismounted, running, which is a technique that looks more controlled than it feels. Norton was inside with the lantern turned up high and the document chest open in front of him, and he turned when he heard me enter, and his face in that moment told me everything about what kind of man he was. There was no surprise in it. There was only the rapid assessment of a tactical problem and the immediate calculation of the fastest solution. He still had the short revolver. I had the belt knife. These were not equivalent instruments. "Marshal Morrow," he said. He said it with the particular contempt of a man who has decided that the titles we give ourselves are only as meaningful as our ability to enforce them. "Former Marshal Morrow. General, you have something that belongs to me." "I have something that belongs to a federal court," I said. "There's a difference." He looked at me with the patience of someone who has been correcting other people's misunderstandings for a long time and is very tired of it. "You are one man in a camp that still has 8 armed men in it. Whatever you are imagining about how this ends, you should revise it. Your armed men are currently chasing a herd of horses through the dark," I said, "and Tate is on the ground outside with a bullet in him. I don't think your personnel situation is as strong as you're describing it." Something shifted in his face. Not the calculation. That was constant. But the confidence that had been underneath it moved slightly. "Even if everything you're saying is true," he said, "you are still in this camp with a knife and I am still holding a firearm. The practical situation has not changed." "You're going to shoot me," I said, "and then you're going to tell whatever story you need to tell about what happened here tonight, and the documents are going to disappear, and 4 years from now someone else's village is going to burn because you needed the land it was sitting on." "That is a dramatic way of describing resource allocation," he said. 21 people died at Running Creek," I said. "Call it what you want." Something moved across his face at that. Not guilt. I did not think Norton was capable of guilt in any form I would recognize. But something. The acknowledgement of a fact that he had spent 4 years keeping at a manageable distance and which had just been placed directly in front of him at close range. "The documents are already distributed," I said. "I sent copies before I came into this camp, to 3 different law offices and to the Santa Fe Gazette. You can shoot me and take back whatever is in my coat, and it will not change what is already in other people's hands." I was not certain this was true. I had not actually sent copies. What I had sent 3 days ago from Duskwell, before I fully understood the scope of what I was walking into, was a letter to a former colleague in Albuquerque describing the general nature of what I was investigating and asking him to be alert for news from the Crimson Pass area. It was not the same as distributed copies of the actual documents. But Norton did not know that, and the specific quality of uncertainty on his face told me he was not willing to bet on it. He held the revolver on me for a long moment. Then a voice came from behind him. "Lower the gun, General." Norton turned his head slightly. He did not lower the weapon. Danny Reeves stood at the entrance of the structure. He was 19 years old and he was holding a service revolver with both hands, and his arms were not entirely steady, and his face was the face of someone who is doing something that requires every unit of courage they possess and is not entirely certain they possess enough. But he did not lower his arms. "Son," Norton said, in the voice of a man who has commanded other men for 30 years and knows exactly how to use that fact, Lower that weapon and step back. You don't understand what you're involved in." "I understand enough," Danny said. His voice was not entirely steady either, but the words were clear. "I know what happened at Running Creek. The woman told me, outside when she came to talk to me." Norton looked at him for a moment. "One conversation with an Apache woman and you're prepared to end your career." "My career was ended the night you sent me here without telling me what I was guarding," Danny said. "I just didn't know it yet." Norton's calculation was visible on his face. Not emotion. Pure calculation. He was running the numbers, assessing the variables, trying to find the version of this situation that came out in his favor. There were 8 armed men somewhere in this camp, but they were pursuing horses in the dark, and the torches outside had not moved, and the specific silence surrounding the structure in this moment suggested that no one within earshot understood what was happening inside it. Norton was alone in a room with a man he could not shoot without consequences, being held at gunpoint by a subordinate who had just been given a reason to point the gun, and the documents that represented his leverage over everything had been removed from his possession. He lowered the revolver. He did it slowly, with the control of someone who wants to be understood to be complying by choice rather than necessity. He set it on the camp table and stepped back from it, and he looked at me with an expression that I recognized from my years in the Marshal Service, the expression of a man who has lost the immediate engagement and is already thinking about the longer game. "This is not finished," he said. "No." I agreed. "It isn't. But tonight's portion of it is." I picked up the revolver from the table and stepped back to stand beside Danny. The young soldier was still holding his weapon up, and the effort of it was visible in his shoulders now, the particular exhaustion of sustained tension that the body was not designed to maintain indefinitely. "You can lower it," I told him quietly. He did. His arms dropped and he exhaled a long, shaking breath and looked at the ground for a moment, the way a person does when the thing they were braced for has passed, and the body does not know immediately what to do with the energy it prepared. "You're going to be all right," I said. He looked up at me. He had a young face, the kind that has not yet been sufficiently weathered by the world to settle into a permanent expression. In it I saw the specific mixture of relief and horror that belongs to someone who has just understood what they were almost part of and what that would have made them. "The woman," he said. "Nora, did she get the horses out?" "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "I believe so, but I don't know yet." He nodded. He seemed to understand that not knowing yet was something you had to live with until the information became available. Outside, the noise of the camp had changed. The urgent, purposeful quality of the initial response was giving way to something less organized, which meant the pursuit had not gone the way Tate's men had expected. Whether that was because the horses had cleared the exit or because something else had happened, I could not determine from inside the structure. I bound Norton's wrists behind him with the length of cord from the document chest, using the double-loop knot I had learned in my first year as a marshal from a man who had been restraining people considerably longer than I had been alive, using the same knot I had learned in my first year as a marshal from a man who had been tying people up for considerably longer than I had been alive. Then I tied him to the camp chair, which was not going anywhere because it was a heavy military camp chair staked to the ground, and I left the revolver with Danny. "Keep him there," I said. "If he tries to move, you don't have to shoot him. Just put the barrel against the back of his head and tell him to stop. That will be sufficient." Danny looked at the revolver, then at Norton, then back at me. "Where are you going?" "To find out about the horses." I went outside. Tate was where I had expected him to be, on the ground near the entrance to the large structure, leaning against the wheel of Norton's coach. He had torn a strip from his shirt and wrapped it around his upper arm, which was where the bullet had caught him. It was not a killing wound. It was a wound designed to incapacitate without killing, because Norton had wanted him alive long enough to manage the situation, and this told me something about Norton's plans for the next step that I filed away for later. Tate looked up at me with an expression that was somewhere between pain and something I could not immediately categorize. He was a man in his 40s with a hard face and eyes that had been calculating something for so long they had forgotten how to do anything else. I had spent 6 weeks building a case against this man. I had looked at the results of what he had done at Running Creek, and I had organized that evidence into a form that should have put him in front of a court, and then I had watched it be set aside. Looking at him now, I felt something I had not expected. Not satisfaction, not anger. Something more complicated than either. "You know who I am," I said. "Marshal Morrow," he said. The same contempt Norton had put into it, but weaker now, diluted by the arm and by the fact that he was on the ground. "You've changed some. 4 years will do that. Norton sent you a message 4 years ago," he said. "Through Holt. He said you could walk away clean if you dropped it. You didn't drop it, but you didn't fight either. He always said that made you the most dangerous kind of man, the kind that hasn't decided yet." I looked at him. "Tell me about the garrison land," I said. "The full plan, what Norton needed Running Creek for." He looked at me for a long moment, calculating, always calculating. "It won't change anything," he said. "It'll change what the federal court knows when they try him," I said. "Which will affect how thoroughly they investigate, which will affect how many other things come out. You want to be the only person who goes down for this, or do you want the people who gave you the orders to go down with you?" He looked at the entrance to the large structure for a moment, thinking about Norton sitting inside it. Then he started talking. He talked for 11 minutes. I listened and did not interrupt, because when a man decides to talk, you let him find his own way through it, and because every detail he gave me was another thread in a net that was going to be very difficult for Norton and Holt to escape from. When he was done, I left him where he was because he was not going anywhere on his own, and I walked to the northern exit of the valley. The moon was high, and the desert beyond the exit was pale and wide, and for a moment I saw nothing. Then I saw them. A mile out, moving steadily northeast in the silver light, a dark mass that resolved as my eyes adjusted into individual shapes, horses moving together with the particular purposeful quality of animals that know the direction they are going. At the front, a pale shape. Morning. And beside Morning, the figure of a woman on horseback, moving with the ease of someone who had been doing this her whole life and would have found it difficult to explain to someone who had not. I stood at the exit of the valley and watched them go, and felt something release in my chest that I had not known was held there. They were out. The horses were out. Nora was out. I went back into the camp and found Danny still holding the revolver on Norton with the specific expression of someone who has been given a job and intends to do it correctly. "It worked," I told him. He closed his eyes for 1 second. "The horses. All of them." He opened his eyes. He looked like a different person than the one who had been standing on the western perimeter 3 hours ago, though I could not have said precisely what had changed. Something had resolved in his face that had been unresolved before. "What happens now?" he said. "Now?" I said, "We wait for morning." The morning came over the red mountains with the slow deliberateness of something that understood its own importance. I had kept watch through the remaining hours of the night, and when the light began to show in the east, I woke Danny, and we walked Norton out of the large structure and sat him against the wheel of his own coach, and the irony of that did not require comment. Tate's men had come back in ones and twos through the early hours, horseless and subdued, having spent the night chasing a herd that had simply outrun them into country they did not know well enough to follow. They took one look at the configuration of the camp and at the revolver Danny was holding, and made the decision that most men make when the specific proposition in front of them is working for wages against fighting for principle. They began quietly to drift away. By sunrise, there were 4 of them left sitting at the dead fire with the expressions of men who had calculated their options and found them limited. 2 of Tate's longtime associates who probably had enough personal exposure to federal warrants to make flight seem inadvisable. 2 younger men who seemed to be there primarily because they did not know what else to do. I let them sit. The sun cleared the peaks and turned the red rock walls to something close to gold, and in that light the basin looked different than it had in the dark, smaller and more ordinary, the kind of place you would pass through without stopping if you were going somewhere else. And then I heard horses. Not the sound of the stolen herd which was long gone. This was a smaller group, a dozen animals perhaps coming from the north, which was the direction Nora had taken the herd the night before. I stood and watched the northern entrance. Nora came through first on a gray horse I had not seen before. Behind her came 3 riders. I did not know mescalero men in their 30s and 40s who moved with the steady purposefulness of people who had ridden through the night to get somewhere. And behind them on Morning, with his small hands wrapped in the white horse's mane and his face showing the particular expression of a child who has been told to hold on and has taken the instruction with complete seriousness, was a small boy. Roy. He was 5 years old, and he was wearing a coat that was slightly too large for him, and his hair was loose around his face, and he looked at the camp, and at me, and at everything around him, with the wide, direct eyes of a child who has been brought somewhere interesting, and is determining what to make of it. Nora pulled her horse to a stop, and looked at me for a moment across the open ground between us. Then she looked at Norton sitting against the wheel of his coach with his wrists tied. Then she looked at the 4 remaining men at the dead fire. Then she looked back at me. "The horses are home," she said. "All of them." I nodded. "Morning is home," she said, more quietly. "I see that," I said. "You are Caleb," he said. It was not a question. Nora had told him. "I am," I said. He considered this for a moment, looking me over with the thoroughness of a child conducting a genuine assessment. "Koanora said you found Morning," he said. "Koanora found Morning," I said. "I just opened the gate." He thought about this. "That is still important," he said with the gravity of someone who has considered the matter and reached a conclusion. I looked at Nora. Something moved through her expression that was not quite a smile, but was related to the look of a person watching 2 things that belong together find each other without being told to. The mescalero riders had dismounted and were moving through the camp, assessing not hostile, but not deferential either. 2 of them went to speak to the 4 men at the fire in low voices. One of them went to look at Tate still propped against the coach wheel, and exchanged a long look with him that contained more history than I could read. I walked to Nora. "The documents," I said, and touched my coat. She nodded. "I know. You need to get them to Duskwell. To the authorities beyond Duskwell, 3 counties, and the Gazette." "Yes." "The judge," I said. "Price. His name is in the correspondence. He was part of it." She held my gaze steadily. "I know what that means. It means the case goes over his head, federal level. It means it will take time, and it will be contested, and it will not be simple." "The things worth doing are not simple," she said. "I learned that a long time ago." She looked down at Roy, who was still on Morning's back, sitting with the comfort of a child who has been on horses from infancy and treats them as furniture. "He has not let go of the mane since we started riding," she said. "I told him he did not have to hold that tightly. He said he wanted to anyway." I looked at the boy on the white horse. The morning light was full now, and the basin was warm, and the red walls around us had settled into the ordinary fact of themselves, stone and shadow, and the kind of age that makes everything human seem briefly small, and then somehow more important because of it. I had been in this territory for 7 days. I had come into it as no one in particular, going nowhere in particular, with $31 and a horse and the low-grade chronic ache of a man who has been failing to outrun something for long enough that he has almost forgotten what he was running from. I stood in the morning light with a set of documents in my coat that were going to make the next several months of my life complicated and unpredictable and possibly dangerous, and I looked at Nora Swiftwind and at the boy on the white horse and at the mescalero riders moving through a camp that had held their horses and would hold them no longer, and I thought about what she had said to Roy. Whether a person can be both a bad person and a good person at the same time. I did not have a complete answer. I suspected the answer was not the kind that arrives complete, but the kind that you build slowly out of individual choices, each one adding or subtracting something from the structure until the shape of what you are becomes visible not to yourself, but to the people around you. I had made bad choices. I had made them out of recognizable human, understandable motivations that did not make them any less bad. I had carried them for 4 years in the form of a worn badge and a habit of moving before I had to stop and look at anything too closely. Last night I had made different choices. They were not enough to balance what came before. I did not think in terms of balance anymore because balance suggested that the wrong things and the right things were equivalent weights on opposite sides of a scale, and I did not believe that. Thomas Swiftwind was dead. 21 people at Running Creek were dead. No number of right choices would change that. But Roy had morning back, and the letters were in my coat, and the sun was up. I walked to the edge of camp where dust was tied and began to prepare for the ride to Duskwell. Nora came to stand nearby while I worked, not helping, just present, which is a different thing. The documents need to be in 3 places by end of day, I said. 1 copy to Sheriff Harmon in Mesilla, 1 to the Federal Circuit Office in Las Cruces, and 1 to the Gazette in Santa Fe. You cannot ride to all 3 in 1 day. No, but I can get to Mesilla and send the copies from there. Harmon is honest. I knew him in the service. And Duskwell? I stopped. I had not fully thought through the Duskwell portion of it, which was not like me, except that the Duskwell portion involved walking into a courtroom and placing myself in front of a judge whose name was in the correspondence in my coat, and that particular calculation had some variables that were difficult to resolve in advance. Price knows his name is at risk, I said. He has known since this operation started that the correspondence existed. He may have been waiting for Norton to bring it back. Or waiting for Norton to ensure it was destroyed, Nora said. Yes. Then he will not know yet which outcome has occurred. I looked at her. You are suggesting that we use the uncertainty, I said. I am suggesting that a man who does not yet know whether he is safe or exposed will make a different decision than a man who knows he is exposed. She was right. It was the kind of tactical thinking that came from years of navigating situations where the formal power was entirely on the other side and the only leverage available was informational. She was considerably better at it than I was. I will come with you to Duskwell, she said. I started to say that was not necessary. She looked at me with an expression that ended that sentence before I had completed it. You will walk into that courtroom alone, she said, and Price will have a clear decision in front of him. He can convict you on whatever charges he has assembled, take possession of whatever you are carrying, and use the next 24 hours to contain the situation before the external copies reach anyone who can act on them. Or he can let you go and begin to consider his own options. I'm aware of the decision tree, I said. What you are not aware of, she said, is that a former marshal walking into that courtroom alone is a manageable problem for a man like Price. A former marshal walking in with a Mescalero woman who carries her own copy of the correspondence and who is prepared to speak to a territorial newspaper is a considerably less manageable problem. I looked at her for a moment. You made a copy, I said, last night while you were watching the camp before we went in. I did not have access to the original, but I had time and I had paper, and I wrote down everything you had already told me: the chain of authorization, Norton's name, Holt's involvement, the land scheme at Running Creek. It is not a copy of the documents. It is a sworn account from a direct witness based on the testimony of the investigator who built the original case. She paused. It is not a copy of the documents themselves. It is a sworn statement of what a witness with direct knowledge of the Running Creek incident understands those documents to contain. It is not the same thing legally, but in the hands of a newspaper it is sufficient. I stood with Dust's saddle in my hands and looked at her. She had been doing this in parallel. While I had been focused on the camp, on Norton, on the physical documents she had been building, a second line of approach that did not depend on me surviving the night with the originals intact. She had not told me because she did not need to. She had simply done it the way you do a thing that needs doing when you are not certain the other person will manage their portion. I thought about what she had said the night before, sitting across from me in the cold camp above the basin. I am not asking you to trust me. I am not offering you my trust. I am suggesting that 2 people with different information and different skills are more likely to succeed than one. She had understood from the beginning what this was. Not a rescue, not a debt being repaid. A genuine partnership between 2 people who needed different things from the same outcome and who were, whatever else might be true between them, considerably more effective together than apart. I put the saddle on Dust. "All right," I said. She nodded once. Roy had climbed down from Morning and was standing nearby with his hand on the horse's neck looking up at me. "Is Morning coming to Duskwell?" he asked. "Morning is going home with you," I said, "where he belongs." Roy thought about this with the seriousness he applied to all important questions. "Will you come to visit Morning after?" I looked at Nora. She was looking at the middle distance, which was the expression of someone who is allowing a question to be answered without influencing the answer. I crouched down to Roy's level. He looked at me with his father's eyes, dark and direct, the eyes of someone who had not yet learned to soften a gaze before pointing it at a stranger. I had not known Thomas Swiftwind, but I recognized something in that look that Nora had described, the kind of seeing that does not ask permission first. "Yes," I said, "I will come to visit Morning." Roy nodded, satisfied. Then he went back to the horse, pressing his small face against the white neck, and Morning stood completely still for him, the way horses stand still when they understand they are needed. I straightened up and found Nora watching me, not with the assessment she had worn for the past 2 days, with something quieter and less defended, the look of someone who has been waiting to see a particular thing happen and has just seen it. "We should ride," she said. We rode. The road to Duskwell was 2 hours south through the morning heat, and we rode it with the documents in my coat and Nora's sworn statement in her saddlebag, and the particular silence of two people who have been through something together and are still in the process of understanding what it means. We did not talk much on the road. Once Nora said, "Thomas would have liked you." I did not know what to say to that. I held it carefully, the way you hold something you have been given that you are not certain you deserve. "I would have liked to know him," I finally said. She nodded, looking ahead. That was all. The courtroom in Duskwell was as I had left it in the opening of this story, which is to say it was full of the kind of silence that exists when people are waiting for a verdict. Harlan Price was behind his bench. The room had perhaps 20 people in it, the usual mix of curiosity and civic obligation and appetite for consequence that fills a small-town courtroom when something significant is being decided. I walked in with my wrists in the custody of Sheriff Briggs, who had come to meet me at the edge of town with the expression of a man who was not entirely sure which version of events he was participating in. Nora walked in behind me, unconstrained, carrying herself with the kind of presence she carried, the kind that does not ask permission from a room before occupying it. Price looked at me. Then he looked at Nora. Then he looked at Briggs with the expression of a man asking a question he did not want to ask out loud. Briggs looked at the floor. I told the story. I told it from the beginning, from riding into Duskwell 7 days ago through the canyon and the meeting with Nora and the ride to Crimson Pass through the night in the camp and the documents and the confrontation with Norton and Danny Reeves standing in the entrance of the large structure with a service revolver and adequate conviction. I told it in order and without embellishment because the facts were sufficient and embellishment would have given Price something to question. And when I reached the part about the documents, I placed them on the clerk's table. And I told the room about the third name. I did not look at Price when I said it. I looked at the room, at the 20 people sitting in the rows of chairs, at the window with the morning light coming through it at an angle, at my own hands, which were no longer bound, because Briggs had found a reason to remove the restraints when I told him quietly outside the courtroom door what he was about to hear. The room was very quiet when I finished. Price sat behind his bench for a long time. He looked at the documents on the clerk's table. He looked at Nora, who was standing against the side wall with her arms folded and her eyes on him, not hostile, not pleading, simply present and watchful and impossible to dismiss. He looked at the room. 20 people who had just heard his name read from a letter that connected him to the covering up of a massacre. He looked at me, and I saw in his face the thing I had been watching for since I walked in. Not guilt, not remorse. Something more complicated and less clean. The specific reckoning of a man who has held a thing at a careful distance for a long time and has just had it placed directly in front of him, close enough that the distance is no longer available as a strategy. He picked up his pen. He set it down again. The room waited. "The charges against the defendant Caleb Morrow," he said in a voice that was entirely controlled, "are insufficient to warrant conviction. This court finds no grounds to proceed." He paused. "The defendant is free to go." He stood. At the door to his chambers, he stopped with his back to the room. "4 years ago," he said to the door to the wall to the air in front of him, "I made a decision that I justified to myself in terms that seemed adequate at the time." Nobody moved. "They were not adequate," he said. And he went through the door. I stood in the middle of the courtroom and listened to the room begin to breathe again around me. Then I walked out into the morning. Nora was already on the steps. She had come out ahead of me because she had not needed to hear the end of it. She had known how it would end when Price looked at the 20 people in the room and understood that the distance he had relied on was gone. Roy was not with her. He had ridden back with the Mescalero men and with Morning, and by now he was probably home. Probably with his small face pressed against the white horse's neck in the manner he had discovered and intended to use as often as possible. The sun was fully up. Duskwell's main street was ordinary in the morning light, the dust and the wooden storefronts and the unhurried stillness of a town that is between moments rather than inside one. Nora looked at me. "Mesilla," she said, "and Las Cruces, and Santa Fe." "Yes, today. I will ride with you to Mesilla," she said. "After that I need to go back." "Roy." "Roy," she agreed. I looked at my hands. The hands that had held the worn badge in the firelight 2 nights ago. The hands that had opened the document chest in the dark. The hands that had this morning placed a set of letters on a clerk's table in a small-town courtroom and said out loud the things that should have been said 4 years ago. Not enough. Never going to be enough in the absolute sense. But the horses were home. Morning was home. The letters were in the hands of people who could act on them. Norton was in custody. Tate was going to talk because men like Tate always talk when the alternative is bearing the full weight alone. And Danny Reeves was riding south toward Albuquerque at this moment, toward a family that did not yet know he was coming, carrying the specific lightness of someone who has been given back a future they thought they had forfeited. Nora had done that. She had seen a frightened young man standing alone on a perimeter in the dark and had recognized what he was and had given him a way out. That was not a small thing. That was the kind of thing that changes the shape of a life. I thought about what Roy had asked her. Whether a person can be both. I thought I understood the answer now, or at least the beginning of one. The answer was not a verdict rendered once and held constant. It was a thing in motion. It was the accumulated weight of choices over time, and it did not become visible all at once, and no single night in a basin in the Red Mountains settled it permanently in either direction. But a night like last night moved the weight. That was enough. That was what tonight had to offer, and I had learned not to ask for more than what a thing could give. "I will visit Morning," I told Nora, "when the Mesilla and Las Cruces work is done. A week, maybe 2. She looked at me for a moment with the thing in her expression that I had first seen when I said I would ensure she got back to Roy. Not warmth, not yet. But the door was open. The stone was less solid than it had been. "Roy will be checking every morning," she said. "I suggest you do not make him wait too long." "I won't," I said. She mounted her horse and looked down at me. "You should know something." "What?" "When I tracked you from Duskwell to the canyon that first night, I was planning to stop you from going to Crimson Pass." I looked up at her. "Why?" "Because every time a white man rides toward our trouble with good intentions, it ends with our trouble becoming larger and our autonomy becoming smaller. I have seen it enough times to have developed a policy about it." "What changed your mind?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "You did not tell me you were going to fix it," she said. "You said you had a reason of your own. And you asked for a direction, not for permission and not for gratitude." She looked toward the south road. "That was different enough to be worth watching." She turned her horse and started down the street. I mounted Dust. The old horse turned his head and looked at me with one eye the way horses do when they are checking on you, and I put my hand briefly on his neck, and he made a sound low in his chest that was the hoarse equivalent of acknowledgement. "One more road," I told him. He already knew. He was already moving. I caught up with Nora at the edge of town where the road turned south toward Mesilla, and we rode out of dusk well side by side into the late morning desert, and the red mountains were behind us now, and ahead of us the land was wide, and the sky was the particular blue that only exists at altitude, and the work was not finished, but the part of it that had waited 4 years was done. I did not know what came next. I knew that the legal process would be long and contested, and that Norton had resources I did not, and that Holt would not cooperate without significant pressure, and that Price's courtroom admission was a beginning rather than a conclusion. I knew that visiting Morning meant visiting Roy, and that visiting Roy meant a continued presence in a community that had no particular reason to welcome me beyond the fact that Nora had decided provisionally, and on the basis of observable evidence, that I was worth watching. I knew that I had $31 in my coat pocket, and a worn badge, and a 14-year-old horse, and no address. And I knew that for the first time in 4 years, when I thought about the days ahead of me, I did not think about how to get through them. I thought about what they might contain. That was new. That was something I had not had in a long time. It was enough. Dust carried me south into the morning steady as he had always been, and the desert spread around us in every direction, and the last thing I saw when I looked back over my shoulder was the red peaks of Crimson Pass catching the full light of the risen sun, red as old wounds, red as the beginning of something. I turned back to the road. I did not look back again.